Good morning, class. This video is going to continue talking about the fine-tuning argument by looking at it in the context of Philip Goff's article, A Purposeful Universe, from Aeon magazine, that was assigned for reading this week. In this video, we're just going to review quick the fine-tuning argument. We're also going to review a little bit about the problem of evil, because these two you can think of as forming the two horns of what are going to be Goff's dilemma that he sees himself in with respect to arguments for the existence and against the existence of God. And then that's going to set up the context for Goff's own kind of middle ground that's meant to get out of this dilemma in a way. So remember, we reconstructed the fine-tuning argument as a kind of abductive argument, an inference to the best explanation. And these arguments, they start with making some observation about the world that seems surprising to us and thereby in need of some explanation. And here the observation is just that when we look at the laws of nature, the initial conditions of the universe, and the physical constants, it seems like they are fine-tuned for life. They have exactly the values that they need amongst an infinite amount of different values that they could have had instead, where those values are exactly the ones you need in order for life to be possible. And now, well, given that observation, we want some explanation for why our universe has laws of nature and initial conditions with exactly those values rather than others. And here, according to the theist, their traditional theistic God, an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good creator of the universe, is the best explanation for why these values obtain within our universe. And since that's the best explanation we can come up with, that doesn't guarantee that such a God exists, but it seems to be pretty good evidence for thinking probably that theistic God does exist. Now, we also looked at a reconstruction of this from the 1,000-Word Philosophy article that went as follows. It said, on the atheistic hypothesis that there is no God, it seems like it would be extremely unlikely that the universe would permit life. Since if there were no God, well then the values that the universe has for its physical constants, laws of nature, seems like it would be up to chance. And since there's so many different possible values for those, only a very small portion of them would seem to allow for life, it seems incredibly unlikely that you would randomly get the ones that allow for life rather than the ones that don't allow for life. But on the other hand, on the hypothesis that there is this perfect God, well, the idea is it'd be extremely likely that the universe would permit life, would have those values, because God, being all good, would presumably want there to be life in the universe. Being all powerful would have the power to set the laws of nature at the values necessary. And presumably being all-knowing would know exactly where those dials need to be set in order to allow life to develop. Given that comparison, the idea is the universe permitting life, having the values that allow for that, seems to provide strong evidence that God exists. I suggested that the best way to think about this in relation to the abductive argument is that it's trying to explain or give support for why we should think that the traditional theistic view is the best explanation. The idea here is, on the atheistic view, it looks like you have to appeal to chance, but that's not a very good explanation for fine-tuning. And on the traditional theistic view, you get to appeal to the knowledge and power of God. That seems to provide a better explanation for fine-tuning, since it would make those values more likely. And so, since it seems to be the best explanation, that fine-tuning is strong evidence for traditional theism. But the important thing to consider here is this is one piece of evidence in favor of God's existence. You would have to weigh that against maybe evidence against God's existence as well. And the main piece that we looked at earlier was this argument from evil. Now, we'd focused on the logical problem of evil. However, most philosophers think that the logical problem of evil could be solved. Now, developing any kind of solution to the logical problem, it isn't easy and straightforward. It raises a whole number of concerns about free will, about God's omniscience, and we investigated a lot of those concerns and looked at some of the knots you'd have to untangle and how you'd try to untangle them. But most philosophers think that it's at least possible to tell a story where God and evil would both exist. And that's why most philosophers today focus on what's known as the evidential version of this problem, which claims, okay, there's no logical contradiction between the evils in our universe and God's existence. However, the existence of the evils that we see, or the kinds of evil, or the amount of evil, or the distribution of evil that we see within our universe, they say even though it doesn't contradict God's existence, it still provides some strong evidence against God's existence, and thereby provides evidence for atheism. So we can try to understand the reasoning here by constructing an evidential version of the argument from evil. This version starts out by claiming, look, when we look at certain evils and certain examples of suffering in the world, and we try to find some actual reason that would justify God in allowing that particular evil or that particular amount of evil, etc., like we look for some greater good out there that God couldn't get without that evil, or we look for some greater evil that God couldn't avoid without allowing this lesser evil. We just can't find those justifying reasons. And the idea is, since we can't find any plausible God justifying reasons, well, probably some of the evils and suffering that actually exist in the world don't actually have any God justifying reasons for allowing. And the idea here is that these evils are very likely to be gratuitous. They don't serve any greater purpose. It's not that they couldn't serve a greater purpose. It's just that when we go looking for that greater purpose, we can't find any plausible example of what that might be. And that gives us good reason to think that there probably isn't any. That's why we can't find them. But the idea is that if God were to exist, then even if it's possible for evil to exist, we shouldn't be able to find any gratuitous evil and suffering in the world, ones without any reasons to justify them. And thus, God probably does not exist. So notice this third premise is meant to distinguish this from the logical problem, because this third premise doesn't say that it's impossible for God and evil or suffering to both exist, because there could be some justifying reason for God allowing those evils. Maybe that evil leads to some greater good. Maybe that evil allows God to avoid some even worse evil. All right. However, the claim here is that even if God were to exist, there couldn't be any evils for which there was no reason for God to allow them, because God is supposed to be benevolent. All right. And so if God and evil were both to exist, there'd have to exist some God-justifying reasons for allowing those evils. But the second premise says there are at least some examples, or maybe the amount of evil, or maybe the distribution of evil, for which there likely isn't any actual God-justifying reason. Not that there aren't any possible reasons, but there's no actual ones that exist in our universe to justify allowing those evils. And the reason they say there likely aren't any is because when we think really hard and we try to find some greater good that comes from these evils, or some even worse evil that's avoided because of these evils, we often cannot find them. Now, there's a variety of different ways that people have tried to respond to this evidential version of the argument. Some people try to argue that, yeah, it's true that there's lots of evils that appear to be gratuitous to us, but they deny that this gives us good reason to believe that there aren't any such reasons. For our purposes, we're going to focus on this first premise, because some people might try to respond and say, actually, for the evils that we see in the world, we actually are able to identify some plausible reasons that God would allow those. And so they claim that the first premise is false. Now, you might think, well, haven't we already discussed this? Haven't we already given plausible reasons that God might allow the evils we see in the world? We saw that free will defense. Now, the free will defense might give an adequate response to the logical problem to show that it's possible for evils and God to exist at the same time. But it's not as promising as a response to the evidential problem. And that's because while the free will defense might identify a possible explanation for animal suffering and other natural evils, it doesn't really provide a plausible explanation for these kinds of evils that we see in the world. And that's because, look, the dialogues appeal to other free beings, like demons or poltergeists that are freely choosing to create these natural disasters, floods and tsunamis, and torture animals. That's not really a plausible explanation for why those things happen, because it doesn't fit with what we know about the world. We have lots of purely natural explanations for why earthquakes, floods, and tsunamis and disease exist within our world, what causes them. And so while that is a possible explanation, and so there's no contradiction between these things, it doesn't provide us with a plausible explanation for any actual reasons within our universe for allowing those kinds of evils. Similarly, someone might appeal not to demons and poltergeists causing these things, but someone might appeal to something like the story of Adam and Eve, where Adam and Eve initially had this perfect garden where there weren't natural disasters and disease and death and all these evils and suffering, but God gave them free will, and they misused this free will, and the consequence was they were cast out from the garden, and natural evil is thereby a result of those first human beings' free choices. That might be a possible explanation for natural evils that we see in the world that appeals to free will, but it's not a plausible explanation, because the story of Adam and Eve doesn't fit with what we know about the world, because we have lots of evidence for theory of evolution by natural selection that appeals to common ancestors between us and other kinds of species. And so this idea of the fall, while it provides a possible story, it doesn't provide us with a plausible explanation of the actual kind of universe that we live in. Keep in mind that this isn't blasphemous or anything like that. The story of Adam and Eve historically has been read as a metaphor and not as trying to provide a literal history of human beings' origin. It's only relatively recently within the US that a literal interpretation of the Bible has become a very wide-ranging view. Now, there's another response to the evidential problem that tries to identify a plausible reason that God might allow for the kinds of evils we see in the world, including natural evil and animal suffering, that has been quite popular and pretty influential, and it's what's known as a soul-making theodicy. And it tries to explain that the evil that exists within the world might provide us with challenges to overcome, such that by freely choosing to overcome those challenges, it is essential to developing our souls or developing our own character, becoming more compassionate, becoming more generous to others. Developing our own soul instead of just being created with a perfect character initially. It has more value when you achieve that accomplishment, that character, through your own free choices, rather than just being given that perfect character through no effort of your own. There's a number of challenges that people might raise to try to argue that this appeal to soul-making, even if it's a possible explanation for evils, including natural evils in the world, you might think there might need to be some natural evils in order to produce that spark to overcome challenge and develop one's character. But some people worry that there's various features of our observations of evil in the world that might make this seem like a not as plausible explanation as it seems at first. And some of the things they might point to is the amount of suffering in the world. Someone might think that, look, while some suffering might be necessary, some evils might be there in order to give us challenges to overcome and develop our character, you might worry there's just so much suffering in the world. It looks like overkill. It looks like there's much more suffering than would be necessary for helping people develop their character and their soul. And some people might worry about the distribution of suffering. Oftentimes, the people who have already developed pretty good characters, it seems like they experience some of the worst suffering, like the best person you know, like being diagnosed with cancer. But some of the people with maybe the worst characters that need to develop it maybe experience the fewest challenges and just keep getting rewarded for their bad character, in which case it looks like the distribution isn't set at a way that would actually be efficient at producing this kind of soul-making. You might also worry that there seem to be examples where the kind of challenges that people are exposed to, maybe it's set so high that it actually ends up being counterproductive. They start becoming jaded and actually become worse human beings as a result of the challenges that they're faced with. And now, lastly, this is the worry that Goff mentions in our article, appealing to soul-making, like causing one person to suffer so that I develop compassion and generosity. You might think even if that compassion is a good thing, someone might worry that it doesn't actually justify causing that suffering to that other person because it uses them as a mere means to this good purpose. And someone might worry that it's wrong to use people as mere means, even when you're using them as a means to some good outcome. And the primary example that Goff gives that's very famous within moral philosophy is, imagine I take the organs of a healthy person in order to save 5 people dying from organ failure. I use that person to accomplish this very good goal of saving 5 lives, so 5 people live rather than 1. But you might think the way I accomplished that goal ended up using that healthy person as a mere means to my good outcome. And you might think good outcomes do not provide a justifying reason for treating people as mere objects, as mere means to your good goal. And so similarly, using people and causing them suffering, like through cancer, etc., for the purpose of your good goal of creating maybe compassion and generosity in other people still doesn't justify allowing and creating that suffering because it involves using that person as a mere means. This isn't meant to be an in-depth, exhaustive investigation of the soul-making theodicy and the controversies that someone might engage with there. It's meant just to be a summary and a preview of the kinds of issues you might engage with. The real reason we're investigating them is to set up what Goff sees as a kind of dilemma. So he explains it as follows. He says, as a young person, he was raised religiously, he was committed to those religious beliefs, but as he got into his teenage years, started to be compelled by these arguments from evil and rejected the beliefs of his Christian upbringing and became a devout, atheist. But at that point, after getting his PhD, starting to teach, he was scheduled to teach a philosophy of religion course where he taught arguments for and against the existence of God. And he started out by teaching the arguments against God, namely the argument from evil that we were just looking at. And as previously, he says he found them incredibly compelling. And he was reconfirmed in his conviction that there's almost certainly no God in that kind of atheistic worldview. Then he taught the arguments for God's existence during the class, and to his surprise, he found them incredibly compelling as well. In particular, he said the argument from fine-tuning of physics that we just looked at here. He didn't think it could be responded to as easily as he previously thought. But this is what led Goff to his dilemma. On the one side, we have the fine-tuning argument. On the other side, we have this argument from evil. The fine-tuning argument seems compelling to him and seems to support theism, this idea that God exists. But on the other side, this argument from evil seems compelling to him as well and seems to support the conclusion of atheism, that God doesn't exist. But the problem is that those conclusions don't go together. They seem to contradict one another. And so you can't accept both arguments, even though both of them seemed compelling to him. And so the idea is, well, what do you do when you find yourself in this kind of situation? The first option is you might try to find a way of responding to one of the arguments, pulling you in the opposite directions, so you can then accept one and explain how the other is mistaken, despite the fact that it seems initially compelling. So this is the strategy that a theist would take. They're going to say, oh yeah, the argument from evil does seem compelling at first, but here's where the mistake is. What premise is wrong, and here's why it's wrong. And once they've done that, they can explain why it felt compelling at first, but why it's ultimately mistaken, and thereby accept the fine-tuning argument for God's existence. Similarly, the atheist can take this kind of strategy as well and say, okay, well, look, the fine-tuning argument, I see why it's initially compelling, but here's the mistake that it makes in its reasoning. I can show its mistake and thereby make that consistent with accepting the argument from evil and accept my atheistic worldview. But remember, Goff said that when he went through the problem of evil and he looked at all the theistic responses, he didn't find them compelling. He says he doesn't think that they really found a compelling mistake in the argument from evil against theism. And he said when he taught the fine-tuning argument, he looked at the ways in which you might try to respond to it, the kinds of mistakes you might say that it made, and he didn't find those compelling either. And so he finds himself in a situation where he can't really take this tack for resolving this dilemma. But there's another option that Goff doesn't really consider or address. But since both of these are inductive arguments, essentially you could accept that both of them provide evidence for their conclusion, but this is just inductive evidence. And so we just need to weigh these against one another. We weigh the evidence in favor. It really is evidence in favor of God's existence. And there really is evidence in favor of God's non-existence. And now we just need to put these on a scale and weigh them against one another and try to figure out, well, which one provides the stronger evidence, and then tentatively believe that that conclusion is true. Or another option is maybe you do the same weighing process of the evidence for and the evidence against, and you choose to remain agnostic because you think the evidence in favor and the evidence against are equally strong, and they cancel each other out, and so we ought to just maybe withhold belief. So maybe agnosticism is the rational response when we consider these arguments together. But Goff says, for me, Philosophy isn't just an abstract exercise. I live out my worldview. And so I find it unsettling when I don't know what my worldview is. And so the idea here is just that, look, religious beliefs seem to be important to the way that we live our lives. And so it might be really important to try to figure out what you believe about God's existence or non-existence. And so agnosticism might not be fully satisfying given that you want to be able to live out your worldview in this way. But there's a fourth option, and this is the option that Goff ends up taking. And you could argue that the dilemma is a false dilemma, that it sets up two options, and that there's actually other options. There's beliefs between these two that would allow you to do justice and accept both arguments simultaneously and not see them actually as being opposed to one another. So as I said, this is the tact that Goff ultimately takes. We have these two arguments that seem to be supporting incompatible conclusions. But he says, actually, when we get clear about what these arguments are doing, we see that they actually support slightly more subtle conclusions. When you look at the argument from evil, really what you need to look at is that it's targeting this traditional, omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent God. And so it just says that kind of God does not exist. And the fine-tuning argument, he says, actually, it's not clear that it supports God's existence in that traditional sense, but rather it seems to just support this idea that there's like purpose built into our universe. One possibility is that that purpose comes from a traditional God, but he wants to suggest that there are other worldviews that would allow for there to be purpose within the universe that don't rely on that traditional conception of God. And so he thinks once you see what these arguments actually support, you see that they're not actually opposed. You could accept cosmic purpose, using the fine-tuning argument, while also rejecting the traditional God and thereby accept the argument from evil. We haven't actually tried to fill in the details of what that would actually look like. That's what the next video is going to deal with, is what is this middle kind of ground between the traditional theistic view and the very blunt or pure kind of atheism that the fine-tuning argument seems to reject. How can we get cosmic purpose without God? But that's all for this video. I'll see you all in the next one. Bye-bye.